StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories, where biblical stories of the ages come alive.
We ended our last story with a bright light or something awakening Peter, James, and John in time for them to see a glorious sight. They saw two men there with Jesus. And these two men were speaking about those things of which Jesus had talked with his disciples earlier. They spoke about Jesus going to Jerusalem and about him being put to death there. And these two men who were there with Jesus were Moses and Elijah. Remember how surprised Peter and James and John were? They didn't know what to make of this. And then, as they watched, the forms of Moses and Elijah began to vanish. And without thinking about what he was saying, Peter called out, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles or booths, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Continuing with our series on the life of Christ from the Bible, we now conclude the story titled, "Jesus Seeks Rest."
StudyJesus.com presents Bible Stories with your host, Dr. Joe Jackson. Stories directly from God's holy word, told in easy-to-understand story form that the whole family will enjoy, and featuring the work of a talented artist illustrating each week's story. Now gather the family because it's time for this week's Bible story.
But even while Peter was speaking, they lost sight of what had so astonished them. A cloud came and wrapped itself around the bright forms of Moses and Elijah, and they couldn't be seen anymore. But surely they heard a voice coming from the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And it was the voice of God. Peter, James, and John were very afraid. They were so afraid that they hid their faces on the ground. But in a moment, they felt the soft touch of Jesus' hand, and they heard his sweet voice saying to them, "Rise, and don't be afraid." Lifting up their eyes, they saw only Jesus, no one else. Moses and Elijah were gone, but Jesus was left with them, and the Father in heaven had told them to listen to his Son's teachings. As Jesus and Peter, James, and John walked down the mountainside the next morning to join the other disciples, Jesus said to them, "Do not tell anyone what you've seen just now. Wait till I've gone from you, and then you can tell them." How sorry they were to hear Jesus say that. Why couldn't they go now and tell the people about what they had seen? One of the reasons the scribes had given for not believing in Jesus was that the prophets had foretold that Elijah should come before Christ. Do you think that perhaps after seeing Elijah, Peter, James, and John might have thought that if they could now tell the scribes what they'd seen, maybe the scribes would change their mind about Jesus? Wouldn't the scribes then believe that Jesus was the Christ? But Jesus knew best, and he said no. Jesus made them understand that nothing would change the belief in the minds of the scribes that John the Baptist was the Elijah who had been promised. Yet, though Jesus, the Son of God, had come, and the scribes had seen and known him, still most of them didn't believe in him and wanted him put to death. These scribes would treat the Christ in the same way even if the disciples should tell them what they'd seen on the mountain. So Jesus said, "Tell no one until after my death." As they got to the foot of the mountain, they found the other disciples in trouble. They were surrounded by a great crowd of people who seemed to be very angry and very excited, and they were talking in loud tones. And one man among them had his son with him, and his son was a boy who was not only deaf and dumb, but also very ill. And when the father saw Jesus coming, he took his boy to him and said, Master, I beg you, please help my son, for he's my only child. And I've asked your disciples to cure him, but they can't do it. And while the man was talking to Jesus, his son became very ill and fell on the ground and lay there on the ground tossing around. And Jesus asked the father how long his son had been this way. The father answered, ever since he was a little boy. And when he's had these bad spells, sometimes he's fallen into the water and sometimes even into the fire. And I'm afraid he'll be killed. If you can do anything to help him, please do it. Will you not do it? And Jesus said, do you trust me? There's nothing I can't do for one who trusts me. And the father answered, I do trust you. Help me to trust you even more. Then Jesus spoke to the boy who was tossing around on the ground. At once the boy's body became quiet and still, so still that the people said, he's dead. But Jesus took his hand and lifted him up. He wasn't dead. He was now a cured and well boy, not deaf any longer, not dumb any longer, now just like other children. The days Jesus had planned to spend in the northern country were now over. Once more his little band started toward the south. They traveled through Galilee quietly, without stopping to teach or to do any healing. Jesus didn't want the scribes and Pharisees to know that he had returned. And very soon after they came to Capernaum, a man came to the door of the house where they were staying and asked Simon Peter if his master was going to pay the tax. This tax was one which the children of Israel took from their men once a year after they were 20 years old. It was a tax taken in the springtime, and the money was used to pay some of the expenses of the temple service. Peter at once answered yes. And then he went into the house to get the money. Jesus stopped Peter and asked him, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take taxes? From their own children or from strangers? Peter said to Jesus, from strangers. Jesus then said to Peter, then the children are free. I don't need to pay this tax, for it's money given to God, the King. I am the Son of God, and I need not pay taxes to him. Still, that no one may think he has reason to find fault with us, go to the seaside, throw out your hook, catch the first fish that comes up, and when you've opened his mouth, you'll find there a piece of money. Take that piece of money and pay the tax for yourself and me. While they had been traveling on their way, some of the apostles had talked about who should be the greatest in the Master's kingdom. You see, the Lord's apostles still believed that Jesus was the promised king of the children of Israel. They just couldn't think of Jesus as being different from other kings. He tried several times to explain it to them, but they couldn't seem to understand that Jesus would rule the world through his life and teachings, but he would never sit on an earthly throne. The apostles still hoped that before long Jesus would live in a king's palace in Jerusalem, and that they, his 12 best friends, would be the Lord's chief officers. Jesus didn't seem to notice what they were saying at the time, but when they were together in the house at Capernaum, he asked them, what were you talking about on the way? No one wanted to answer the Lord. They were all ashamed to have Jesus know about it, so they kept quiet. But they didn't really need to answer the question because Jesus already knew what they had been saying. Sitting down, Jesus called them to come around him, and he said to them, in my kingdom, The one who wants to be first of all shall be last of all. For not the selfish, but the unselfish are the great ones. To be great is not to have a high office and make other people serve you. It's to be a servant yourself, to be ready at any time to help those who need you. Jesus then called a child to him, and when the Lord had taken the little child in his arms, he said, "Whoever wants to be great in the kingdom of heaven must be like this little child, loving and obedient and trustful." This child does what he knows how to do without thinking whether he has a high place or a low place. And all the time he's growing stronger and better able to fill any place which God may give him. This is the spirit which everyone must have who belongs to my kingdom. For unless you become as little children, you can't enter into it. Though Jesus didn't go out to work among the people, he wasn't idle during those days. There was so much the 12 apostles needed to know before they could do the Lord's work. So Jesus spent his time teaching them. Some of the words Jesus said to them are very precious to us even now. He taught them that the one who did anything for the love of Christ would have his reward in the love of his Father in heaven. Even as little a thing as giving a cup of cold water to someone who was thirsty was enough to win that love. But it's very important that such a cup of cold water given to someone who is thirsty be given because we want to do something for Jesus Christ, who has done so much for us. Anyone, even the youngest and weakest, can get this reward, because it's not given in return for our doing great things, but in return for our great love. And the love of our Heavenly Father is the greatest reward that anyone can have. Jesus showed his apostles what a terrible thing it is to make anyone do wrong and how carefully we should guard against that. He said to them that it would be better for a person to give up everything in this world rather than to do what was displeasing to the Heavenly Father. The Lord told them that just as a man was glad to find a lamb which had been lost, even though he had many more, so the Father was unwilling that anyone, even a child that trusted him, should be lost. Another thing Jesus said to his disciples was that if 2 or 3 people met together to pray for something they wanted very much, he would be there with them, even though they couldn't see him, and he would give them what they asked for. Of course, we must understand that God will not give us something that's bad for us just because 2 or 3 ask him, any more than a good father on earth will give his children something that will hurt them, even if they all ask for it. Sometimes we think God doesn't answer our prayers because he doesn't give us what we ask for. But perhaps what we've been praying for would be very bad for us. And the best answer our Father could give is simply to say no. After Jesus taught them all these things, Peter asked the Lord how often he should forgive his brother for doing him wrong. Peter asked, maybe until 7 times? Peter probably thought that was a lot of times to forgive someone. But Jesus said to Peter, I don't say till 7 times, but until 70 times 7 times. And then Jesus told Peter this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who began to look over the accounts which he kept with his servants. And one of them owed him 10,000 talents, which was a very huge sum of money. And the servant didn't have enough money to pay such a debt. So the king commanded that he should be put in chains, and that his wife and his children and All that he had should be sold in order to get the money to pay this huge debt. The servant couldn't bear to think that his family would be sold as slaves, so he fell down at the king's feet and begged him not to do it. He said to the king, "Lord, if you'll just have patience with me, I'll pay you all I owe you." And he looked so troubled and he begged so hard that the king had pity on him. And the king told him that he needn't pay the debt. The king then forgave him of all he owed the king. Imagine that. And the king then commanded the officers to let him go free. And when the servant left the king, he found another man who owed him just a small amount of money. This man, who owed the servant a little amount of money, was poor and couldn't pay even that small amount to the servant. So the king's servant took him by the throat and he said, pay me what you owe me." But this poor man cried to the servant, even as the servant had cried to the king, and said, "Please, if you will be patient with me, I'll pay you back." But the king's servant would not, and he had the poor man put into prison till he could pay the debt. The king's servant now had just been forgiven a very, very large debt and had a chance to show kindness and mercy to someone else, but he wouldn't. Now, other servants of the king who saw all this told the king about it. And when the king heard the story, he was very angry, and he sent for the servant and said to him, "You wicked servant, I forgave you of that great debt because I was sorry for you. Oughtn't you to have had pity as well on the man who owed you a small amount?" And then the king ordered his officers to take the servant to prison and to keep him there till he paid his debt. After telling this story, Jesus said, "So will my heavenly Father do to you if you do not from your hearts forgive those who wrong you."
Precious memories, unseen angels, sent from somewhere to my soul.